Comrades, thanks very much for coming on this evening. It's great to have you here. Please introduce yourselves to the audience one at a time, telling people a little bit about each of your personal backgrounds.
Hi, my name is Fergal and Stephen. I joined the CYM a decade ago when I was 14. I served as national chairperson from 2015 to 2018. I'm currently the international officer and editor of Forward, our publication. I joined the Communist Party as soon as I turned 18, and I was a member for 6 years. And during some of that time, I was chair of the Cork branch. I was one of the founders of Connolly Youth Society, UCC, which is still going strong today. I'm a proud Duhallow man in Cork, an area renowned for its high output of famous communists. Like most of the leadership of the British and Irish Communist Organisation and the Baltic Quill, to give another example. In my spare time, I like to repair computers and record bad shoegaze covers.
Great stuff, thank you, comrades. Stephen?
Hi, my name is Stephen. I joined the CYM by end of 2018. I'm currently serving as the Deputy General Secretary and Secretary of the Belfast branch. So basically, a lot of admin work there. And I'm originally from Derry. Been living in Belfast for a few years. I would be from a working class background in Derry, but not a highly political one, which seems to be very characteristic of the Belfast branch membership as a whole. Some we're very proud of that. We've kind of brought younger people who before weren't interested in or maybe not maybe hadn't identified communism or socialist republicanism as the answers to the issues facing their class. And I helped establish the Derry branch of the CYM as well, so quite proud of that.
Fantastic. Spartan work. Thank you very much, comrades. Appreciate that. So let's get into it. There's a big conversation to be had here. A lot of people have asked a lot of questions about this, about what's going on. There's been a lot of rumors and speculation. So let's set the record straight. The Connolly Youth Movement has recently announced that it is disaffiliated from the Communist Party of Ireland. So what exactly has changed now regarding the relationship between the Connolly Youth Movement and the Communist Party of Ireland?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I want to jump in on this just at the start, because I think one of the important things that people need to understand about this conversation is that the CYM wasn't and has never really been structured the same way that a communist youth league or a young communist league would be to a communist party, where it would be organisationally independent, but would be politically fully unified through a programme, basically making it a wing of the same organisation. The CYM has always had, at least in my time anyway, a independent political programme. Now, in that programme, it did endorse the Communist Party of Ireland. It allowed for dual membership, and it established a fraternal relationship between that. So it's not the same organisation splitting off into two organisations. It's a distancing from one organisation to what would have been loosely defined as its smaller party, but up until recently would have had a formal fraternal relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like a lot of the changes are things that kind of occurred in the past already, and the disaffiliation is really about kind of updating paper to a new reality. So individual CPI members in Dublin could refuse to carry out stalls with us at a whim, and other individuals in local branches could also, just on a whim, decide to stop working with the CYM because there was no formal kind of structure for the relationship from the internal perspective of CPI. We found a lot of kind of like little kind of petty things were going on, like no longer encouraging kind of new recruits to the CPI to also join the CYM because they considered it a rival organisation and all of this kind of nonsense. Our work was at kind of a higher level in volume than ever over 2020. like even as we shifted away from kind of physical operations to online operations in light of the pandemic, our membership continued to grow, and I think we probably had more activities in 2020 than we did most years, in spite of any adversity. So really, when we were still growing and we still had to adapt to new circumstances and we were facing certain difficulties with the pandemic, it was inevitable that we were going to reach an impasse with the clique leading to CPI, and collaboration broke down in that context. The CPI constitution, as Stephen pointed out, never mentioned the CYM. So mutual support could be kind of terminated whenever they felt like it in between congresses, or even if the general secretary felt like he didn't want to collaborate or coordinate with the leadership of the CYM, it could be unilaterally withdrawn, and we'd lose probably a huge amount of elbow space in terms of how we came up with our strategy and how we kind of strategize about our approach to politics. Like, we found ourselves in a situation where we didn't have a party to formally rely on for the future. Formal disaffiliation gives us the freedom of action to explore options that will fix this and ensure that we have a space to go into. Because it's important to remember that in any political organization that's serving as a political home for people, if you're in a cadre organization, most of us, I think, will consider it a lifelong commitment, or would at least be looking beyond the immediate future into the long term. And if you don't have an organization that's fit for purpose for you to continue your political journey in, then it kind of gives a sense of hopelessness or a sense of kind of impasse or being stagnating.
Yeah.
An analogy is that, like, the CYM is like a tree that stopped growing because it reached a ceiling, and now we've removed that ceiling again, and the only challenge facing us is deciding which direction we go towards. Now that we're in the light of day, there are going to be a lot of tough questions in the transition period, but overall we're in a better situation than where we started out in, where we know that we're going to grow, and we're, rather than continue to stagnate, even if we do have to face some tough challenges in adapting to the new environment.
Yeah, I think Fergal is spot on there. There seems to be a little bit of an echo. I think that's gone now.
Yeah. It's gone now, yeah. So that's gone. We'll just
Yeah,
that little bit out. It's grand.
no problem. So yeah, I think Fergal's pretty spot on there. Now when Fergal and myself have kind of hinted so far as to that, you know, the relationship was only really formalized within the CYM's constitution and program as a fraternal link between the organisation. Now, as Fergal's kind of helpfully described there, the CPI not once mentions an organisation called the Connolly Youth Movement within it. So, you know, off that basis, they could kind of have a little bit of an ad hoc approach to the CYM. And I think it's important to say here, just before we can continue, that the question of the CYM's relationship to the CPI isn't in a vacuum. These questions are the result of internal problems within the CPI, particularly as a former dual member, being a CPI member, CPI member based in the north. There was a lot of kind of factionalism from, as we soon to identify them as a clique based around the General Secretary of the CPI in Dublin. It basically just meant that their only relationship was really defined by material support, by custom, kind of practice and tradition, kind of, not to be too legalistic about it. But, in my mind, if we're looking at it that way, and, we did release a statement as well on the disaffiliation itself, in my mind, that clique surrounding the General Secretary forced the rest of the organisation within the CPI to disaffiliate from us, by the expulsion of members, by also the barring of applications as well, as just sort of general hostile actions. Considering all these different elements within the CPI, I think it's important they say as well that on behalf, I think I can speak, on behalf of the organisation, the CYM, does not view the CPI as a whole as hostile. And, this isn't an exercise here in sort of discrediting the good comrades within the CPI. I think it's telling that within the CPI, still after disaffiliation, we enjoy mutual support and a working relationship with the good comrades in there. We still share many of the same aims. And, I am doubtful that support will change, in the future as things develop. We know, just because I'm still in touch with all those comrades as well, that the people within the CPI who are still giving us that mutual support, they're starting to be disciplined now within that organisation, within the CPI. So I think all that's important before kind of moving on. I think one thing that we forgot to mention specifically within the CPI is that the CPI constitutionally is separated into two different areas, north and south, and it kind of largely played out that the NEC, based in Dublin, were kind of overstepping the constitution, and kind of issuing down dictates to the area committees, south and north, overstepping their autonomy, and it's basically a wider point on the attitude of the NEC of the CPI, because the NEC of the CPI at this juncture views itself as the highest decision-making body, the highest body within the organisation, decision-making and operational. But as we know, a communist organisation, the highest decision-making body is the Congress, or it is the Ardèche. The language that we started to use based around that was, we identified it as ultra-centralist, essentially, characterised by that unaccountable kind of leadership, I'm sure, and ad hoc decision-making. I'm sure we'll go into that later on as we go into more specifics. But basically, as I understand it, and as the CYM understands it, democratic centralism, there's two components to that, right? There's democracy and there's centralism. And they're supposed to exist, dialectically between each other. One shapes the other, one informs the other. And when an organisation becomes heavily centralised, you do see, as a consequence of that, you do see, a clique surrounding the General Secretary within the CPI. You do see NEC dictates that go against the autonomy constitutionally of the area bodies within the organisation, and branches.
You also see the NEC being used almost as kind of almost a heavy-handed disciplinary vehicle in of itself. It interferes in what should be branch kind of obligations and roles, just as almost kind of like a steamroller for the personal whims of a very small number of people once they're in control of it. It kind of butts into a lot of areas where really the NEC should be looking more at national priorities than someone's trying to break apart branches and reconstitute them and that sort of thing.
Would you mind, I'm just conscious that some people might not be aware, would you mind just explaining what the NEC is and how that maps on, just generally like in an international context, what that would map onto within a communist organisation? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, so the NEC is the National Executive Committee. It's elected every 3 or 4 years at a All-Ireland Congress. Each branch, I don't think at the previous Congress there was a delegate system, but basically it's a free vote where whoever 14 people, I think it's 14, who receive the highest number of votes matriculate onwards to the NEC, and anyone who falls below that 14th candidate minimum is discounted as an NEC representative. So the idea is that the NEC is supposed to be the All-Ireland governing body for the CPI, which is, in terms of the Constitution, above both the Northern Area Committee and the Southern Area Committee, as well as individual branch and region structures, such as, for instance, the Cork branch, the Munster Council, or the Belfast branch. However, there's been a worrying trend in the CPI since the previous Congress of co-options. There have been a lot of resignations over different kind of procedural issues and a lack of democratic fairness in the NEC. And the result of this has been that the empty spaces on the NEC have been filled through a general vote of the NEC rather than a vote of the organisation. And so the actual composition of the NEC has changed drastically since the one that was elected through a free vote at the last Congress. The whole co-option system is, understandably for situations that are unlikely to arise, for emergency situations where someone is incapacitated or due to personal reasons needs to leave their role, when co-options are used as a kind of political realignment tool to totally change the nature and the composition and the voting patterns and dynamic of the NEC, it's a much more concerning and much more concerning tendency that I describe as closer to a purge.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that and for making that a little bit clearer for everybody who's listening and listening on this a little bit later. Thank you very much, comrades. There was a lot that was brought up there, really, really interesting stuff. There's a lot that we probably need to dive into over the course of this conversation. So let's push forward. How did this disaffiliation come about? Who are the clique? And what happened at the recent special Ardèche, the recent Congress in the CYM for comrades from overseas?
Yeah, so the CYM Ard Corla and the membership came to the conclusion based on the failure of bilaterals between the CYM AC and the NEC of the CPI, and the expulsion of 3 of our Ard Corla members of the CYM from the CPI, that there was no negotiable solution or viable path to healing the rift that had been provoked by the CPI clique. So we did make huge efforts to heal any differences that had emerged between the party and the CYM. A big part of that was encouraging people from the CYM to get more involved with the party, to have more shared committees and more shared spaces where CPI and CYM members would be talking regularly, where they would be in contact with each other. And so through forming kind of personal rapport and working relationships, then a lot of the misconceptions that people held about each other could naturally be overturned in the course of that process. What we found was that the self-interest of the clique meant that any suggestions for a positive change in the status of our relationship was blocked off. And once it became clear that the CYM wasn't going to play ball with some of the internal ambitions for purging some elements of the party internally, that we were going to be brought into the line of fire and picked off one by one as well. So this clique that I keep referring back to consists of about 2 people from Cork and about 15 in Dublin, and maybe kind of a few more respectables throughout the country. But they hold almost every position of the party governance. They hold a majority on the National Executive Committee, the NEC, and the Southern Area Committee, and almost all branch committee positions in the South. It's based on a system of patronage, co-options, and promotions centered around the General Secretary, and a new body that's been set up to circumvent the natural running of the NEC, which is called the National Officers Committee. And it's all centered around, in terms of its geographical kind of epicenter, of Connolly Books in Dublin.
Yeah, so I forgot if we just cut in here as well. I think one thing that we definitely need to talk about just going forward with this point here as well, is that we can't view CYM Special Ardash again within a vacuum. So we had a very successful Ardash in 2020 before the COVID crisis. It was held in Belfast. It was quite sorry. Oh, COVID. But it was based in Belfast. It was quite successful. It was our largest before the special Ardash. And there was a few, things passed. There was a lot of debate. It was generally quite positive. We actually had a delegate from the CPI at the Belfast one in 2020 as well. Now, crucially, what we've done within that is that, the CYM has always been more kind of like a broad left organization, but within the past few years, the organization has become more ideologically focused, if you will, within Marxism and Marxism-Leninism specifically. And that's basically been a very uniform development within the organization, despite sort of lack of engagement from the CPI generally. Not that's not everyone's experience, but it is a general experience. What we done was that we ratified Marxism-Leninism within our constitution. There was a motion brought forward that I think passed basically unanimously. I can't really remember. That said that socialist republicanism is the expression of Marxism-Leninism in Ireland. There was also a motion that passed further endorsing the Communist Party of Ireland and sort of formally encouraging members who were of age to join the party, which didn't really exist before. It was just sort of advised on a case-by-case basis. Now, after that, the CPI raised grave concerns within the constitution, which hadn't changed too radically from the year before. If anything, as I said, it further endorsed the Communist Party of Ireland. It cemented the CYM officially as a Marxist-Leninist organisation and as a socialist Republican one. So one of the things that they actually brought up as an apparent political difference were things that existed in our programme before 2020 and crucially before our organisation encouraged people to join the CPI. And that was the inclusion of figures such as Jim Larkin and Seamus Costello. I think it's the sort of mark of any good Marxist kind of analysing history, analysing struggle, and just a mark of a basic intelligence sort of mind that you can entertain the ideas and you can entertain past the inspiration from past political figures without necessarily endorsing the organisations that they were a part of, not necessarily endorsing everything about them. So this was basically used as a stick against us. One of the things that we were branded was Costelloites, first and foremost, which
Costelloite unionists.
Yeah, just a lot of things, and again, this wasn't coming from all CPI members. It was coming from basically the majority of the NEC. Within the internal communications, they described socialist republicanism as opportunistic, and the CPI within the internal communications was very the NEC of the CPI rather was very confused within their rebuttals to this. So they initially said within the internal kind of correspondence that CPI was not a socialist Republican organization because it's an opportunistic phrase basically, and it has been used by parties that they would describe as opportunistic, and parties that I probably would also describe as falling the opportunism as well, like Sinn Féin. And then decent organizations as well, like that would be on like the left that would like call themselves socialist republicanism as well. So there was kind of like this almost like intellectual elitism around the term and the outlook. Now, we clarified that socialist republicanism, this isn't the socialist republicanism that Sinn Féin would use. It was the expression of Marxism-Leninism in Ireland. So, and actually within that kind of internal correspondence, initially distancing themselves from the term, then came back to say that the CPI is a socialist republicanism organisation in the vein of James Connolly, and they were corresponding this to an organisation named after the man. So I think from my perspective anyway, and I think from the perspective of a lot of people within the CYM, it was kind of like there was definitely political differences, but they weren't political differences that couldn't have been hashed out within a properly functioning Communist Party that respects minority viewpoints, democratic centrism, etc.
There has to be diversity of thought, and I think a lot of it as well is actually post hoc justifications of other things, because like a lot of the time they don't even really know what they're about themselves internally. Like 1 week, someone might bring up an idea for like leafleting, for example, and a lot of people might rubbish it. Then a few weeks later, the General Secretary will suggest, oh, we should go out and leaflet. And a lot of the members of the clique will suddenly be extremely enthusiastic about it, even though it was being called like, Shinner work or something a few weeks ago or whatever. Like a lot of these like ideological designations are just like functions of convenience for them. I think when you bring it all back to basics, one of the fundamental points for them is that they don't want the party to grow, because growth means change, and every element of that kind of ties into an attempt by the clique to rig the 2021 CPI Congress by jettisoning the CYM and any older colleagues who kind of dissent with them, to ensure that there's an NEC that will continue to be dominated by kind of an insider circle based around family books who can micromanage everything and keep the party small and elitist. Like, it's easy to say that, you went through this deep and perfect process of analysis that led you to an incontestable final line. But at the same time, that's not how they operate on a day-to-day basis. Like, a lot of education sessions degenerate to the point of head-nodding circles, and a lot of it is based around those patronage systems of just waiting for getting kind of like a nod or getting a lead on something, and then it falls to the kind of lower members of the clique to actually build the ideological kind of framework around the whims of the more senior members. For a bit of background on this whole process as well of really wanting to control the membership of the party and ensure that it doesn't grow, they're not re-registering people who they feel have contradicted the outlook of the NEC over the last year. So something that was brought in a few years ago was that the McCartney kind of clique introduced this thing where you had to re-register every January. When they brought it in, they said it was to kind of shake up the party and remove kind of older members who were inactive or were kind of legacy members who would have been active in the 90s or the 2000s, but then kind of fell off the radar, and thus kind of clear out the cobwebs from the actual on-file membership of each branch. But I think it was a much more cynical effort than that, and it's going to come to its logical conclusion where instead of expelling members now, they've switched to just refusing to re-register a large number of members who they don't want back in the party this January, on the basis that re-registration can be refused on the grounds that a member has not been aligned with the NEC over the previous 12 months. So the inevitable outcome of their attempts to cling on to power is always going to end with like short-sighted self-destruction.
Yeah. And you definitely see the kind of picture that we're trying to paint here, was that and it is a true one, in my opinion, was that you did have this kind of clique that was as Fergal said, the organisation at the highest level within the CPI has kind of been characterised by jobs for the boys, kind of patronage, all that sort of stuff. You've had people in positions that have been there, for years and years and years. Suddenly an influx of a lot of young enthusiastic communists, would obviously threaten that, especially because at the last CPI Congress as well, the General Secretary actually, got into the position by a slim margin as well. So I think all that needs to be bared in mind, and you see this internationally. Fergal's our international officer. Maybe we can talk a bit more about this later. He would have a better perspective on this than me. But it's worth pointing out that you see kind of this development between younger communists, and kind of older parties. Particularly in Australia, we know for a fact that our comrades in Australia and the Australian Communist Parties, went through a similar process, and they left and they formed their own party. Now, again, that's not to say that I don't know stellar older comrades that have nothing but respect and admiration for the CYM as I do to them, but it is an international trend as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if you've seen a lot of this stuff, across the world in communist organizations.
And we talked a bit about like ultra centralization there before, and like a big part of that has been financial ultra centralization. So before there was a lot more kind of branch autonomy about finances, but we noticed over the last few years they've been trying to reel in as much of the membership dues from the periphery into the centre around Connolly books as possible. And some of that is completely legitimate, but at the same time, it's difficult to build a transparent sense of the party finances when, for example, the party accounts are considered unaudited, and SIPO has raised this in the past, but didn't decide to follow up on it. There's a huge thing of kind of like party funds being used to reward kind of certain people with profile boosts or something like that, and not properly being used for the purpose of building kind of branches or expanding into new areas, but rather just about strengthening the existing kind of social ties based around the bookstore and kind of the clique. There's been an issue of items left to the party being liquidated without proper supervision, and just in general a huge number of kind of governance issues with how the party's financial life is run. We even believe that there's going to be an attempt to liquidate the party premises in Belfast in order to keep Connolly books kind of taking over. And these party premises and offices are just totally vital to the daily life of activists who are organising in those areas. Like a good party HQ premises or offices can serve as all things to all people. It can be used for various different social groups, for community campaigns, to meet in. It gives people a venue where otherwise people might have to go in and pay €50 to get the use of the upstairs room in a pub for an evening or something like that, which is just placing a massive burden on activists and people in communities who might already be trying to organise against cuts and things like that. Like a small party with very limited resources, asset stripping peripheral branches to consolidate the centre, it isn't just stupidly short-sighted in many cases. It's for the purpose of rewarding loyalty, and the parish pump in a party like Fianna Fáil that we all know is corrupt, and the people get into it for those reasons, is a crime. But in a communist party where you expect people to get into things for the very opposite reason of self-interest and promotion, it's a crime and a sick joke. But supporters of the clique will stick their fingers in their ears and kind of close their eyes out of loyalty to the boss. We all want Connolly Bookstore to stay around and prosper, but maybe it wouldn't be under financial threat if its management was transparent, if more people throughout the party could be involved, and it wasn't used as kind of a vehicle for personal political power to hand out favours. Maybe we'd have a premises for our party members in Galway or Waterford. The only silver lining in this whole mess has been that it's outlined the potential that the party could have. if its governance was better, if it had proper leadership that was accountable and responsible to the party members. There are a huge number of problems in the CPI, and the fact is that there really was a sincere and genuine desire on the behalf of CYM members to engage with these problems, to improve the party, and to kind of fix the issues that had built up and had started causing disillusionment and people to leave the party and that sort of thing. But when you're just coming up against a brick wall where changes that need to happen are quite difficult and rigorous, but you're also working against people who don't want those changes because they would lead to kind of a loosening of their grip on power, then you just kind of at some point end up getting frustrated with the whole thing and saying that, look, we need to consider the broader perspective and ask ourselves how much energy we really would be pouring down this kind of into this cul-de-sac.
Paul, one question that I think we answer here is how the RDS actually came about, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll just sort of go into the kind of mechanisms.
Great.
Kind of, what we have to do about it. So, look, the Ard Corda of the CYM basically polled the CYM membership informally about whether or not they wanted an extraordinary RDS in response to in response to the CPI question. It was voted unanimously in favour. Based off that, the Ard Corda then invoked the clause in our constitution that allows for this kind of RDS to take place, and it can under certain circumstances. The proposed RDS, it lasted 7 hours. Was attended by, it was definitely the largest one that we had there. It was attended by almost 100 voting members within the CYM. So there's a 3-month probationary period within the CYM. Despite COVID, we did actually do have a lot of recruits. We do our kind of interviews online and stuff, but there is still like a 3-month probationary period. They were allowed to attend, but didn't have full voting rights, but could participate in all ways. Basically, we provided the members of the history of the CYM CPI relations in the 20th century, a summary of the recent relations, a full account and debate of the events that basically led to the breaking point last year. The CPI NEC were invited to give a 15-minute talk outlining their case and sent the National Chair and Secretary. Unfortunately, they kind of used that as an opportunity to announce the CYM, to convince CYM members not to disaffiliate, which kind of made our decision a bit easier and a bit easier to take as well, because we obviously approached it as rationally as we could, but obviously there is kind of personal exterior, it is an emotional affair, but at the end of the day we're communists, and we kind of put the interest of our organisation and the interest of our class first on that. In the end, we voted to disaffiliate, passed by a landslide. No one who disagreed with disaffiliation has left the CYM because of this as well. We have unity of action, diversity of thought. This is in direct contradiction with how the CPI has been operating. There was a good atmosphere within it, a lot of fair play. We basically emerged stronger than it rather than weaker. Which was definitely the attitude that we had going in there. But obviously, we were and are now going through a transition period, or a period where there's a little bit of uncertainty.
And we resolve our problems dialectically, and we move forward together. And we're trying to set the opposite trend to what we see in the CPI, where you move forward by removing people or pushing them out, and then proceed in that vein. We try to win over everyone and move forward together as a cohesive unit, rather than breaking ourselves apart through infighting. And I think that's been an important distinction in our style of organisation. It's kind of kept members on board and kept members committed to the organisation. There's been that kind of fairness and process.
Yeah, and I would have definitely experienced that. My own experience at the CPI and CYM, it's like night and day in terms of that democratic process. And as was really hammered home, the unity of action and diversity of thought is it's beautiful to see and actually to be a part of. So, thanks very much for clarifying that, Conrad. That's great. Let's get a little bit more into the background. So, what was the background context for what's happened here?
I'm probably going to let Fergal take the lead in that because he's basically been in like the trenches with all this stuff for the past few years. It kind of ended up being a persona non grata at the end of it. But I do have a particular event in 2017 that I do have a lot of I have my notes on it here. But I can kind of comment at the end. But Fergal, if you kind of want to go ahead of that.
I'll give kind of a quick kind of overview of events up until right before 2020, because I think context is kind of important here to get a sense of like things did accelerate and things did get magnified in terms of the level of the dispute and the grievances that we had in 2020. But these weren't isolated trends unique to 2020. These trends were going back a long time, and it was kind of a long kind of road and process of worsening and deteriorating kind of practices and conditions in the CPI that led us to that point. Now, the CYM has been autonomous, as you mentioned earlier, Stephen, since its foundation. It was certainly under the influence of the Communist Party, but until the 1980s, its members went on to membership of a variety of political organisations after they aged out from the CYM. This is in sharp contrast to some other countries where the youth wing functions basically as a subcommittee of a political party under total control and accountability. Now, in the early 2010s, there was an attempt to roll back some of this autonomy with the current clique in the CPI's earlier form, appointing general secretaries of the CYM, instructing dual members of the CPI and the CYM to vote a certain way on motions, and other forms of kind of unwelcome interference. In 2015, this came to a decisive head with an attempt by the clique to dissolve the CYM and then reconstitute it with a hand-picked leadership. However, the CYM rejected the CPI General Secretary's chosen candidate at our Democratic Congress at the time in favour of a democratically elected candidate. I was chairperson of the CYM at the time, and I worked alongside Alex Homets, the CYM General Secretary, in writing the new constitution for us after that. And our utmost priority, in addition to ensuring the internal democracy of the CYM, was enshrining that constitution, was enshrining checks and safeguards to ensure that the final say for the internal politics of the CYM would always lie with the membership, that we would never again be in a situation where there was a question hanging over our heads, which would be that even if the membership decided that they wanted certain leadership, could the party then go in and change the situation and install its own handpicked leaders and proteges? We staunchly rejected that scenario, and the insinuation that the CYM wasn't an equal partner in the communist movement, but was rather just kind of a recruiting ground for potential CPI members without any respective rights or responsibilities with regard to choosing its own political program and organizational structures. This reaffirmation of our autonomy actually led to a respectful coexistence and collaboration between the CYM and CPI for a number of years. It was actually quite friendly and productive for a couple of years after the initial backlash subsided. It's also important to remember that the clique wasn't in total control at this point, and due to our strong local relationships with party branches, those in the CPI who wanted to suppress the CYM had to kind of hold back and bide their time. The clique was still there, and it was really anti-CYM, but it didn't have a reliable majority on the NEC at all times. After the election at the 2017 CPI Congress, around this time, shortly after the new constitution and the autonomy was reaffirmed in 2015, CYM experienced a massive burst of growth, something that was totally unprecedented in the organisation's history, that led to us establishing branches in every major urban centre in Ireland. CYM was growing so fast at that point that at each Ardèche, the attendance would nearly double. Sometimes after extrinsic major events like the downfall of Corbyn, we would get 10 applications in a single day. As members aged and the CPI experienced personnel problems and made local requests for us to help, and this is an important point, it might seem, and it should seem ridiculous to anyone on the face of it, that a mother party would ask its youth affiliate to not join the mother party and then accuse them of being entries and trying to take over, because it's a fundamental fact of life that youth organisations go on to form the new core, the new generation, and the inheritors of the movement that they're part of. That's the intergenerational contract in the communist movement, which is that both elements of it, the youth and the old guard, they support, they work with, and they kind of nurture each other's respective interests for the purpose of the broader interests of the communist movement. But if, like, at the same time, you have to consider that individual branches of the CPI in the run-up to the instruction in 2020 to get more involved were opining the lack of involvement of CYM members in CPI struggles. So very much CYM members were aware of and were acutely keen about the problems and the internal structural difficulties and lack of standard democratic practice that could pop up from time to time in the CPI. But at the same time, they were still enthusiastic to get involved and to respond to these requests for more involvement. It was only at some point after this when alarm bells started ringing about, well, what if they changed the dynamic of the branches they end up joining? That instead of members in the past being rejected or accepted for their applications in CPI on the merits of their own personal political history and their contributions as individuals, but were instead rejected en bloc and mass solely on the basis that they were CYM members at the time of their application to the CPI. As members aged, at the same time, there was more of a kind of pressure on us to resolve the issue of membership applications, because once members age out of the CYM, then essentially it would mean that they would have no political home. So we passed the motion at our 2020 Congress in Belfast, instructing CYM members to join their local party branch and get active. This wasn't a secret motion now, but it was supported by the regional CPI secretary Adam Murray in Belfast, who was present. But the clique instead used it for a bizarre accusation of entryism, which really doesn't make any sense in the context of how the process originated and also just how the fundamental relationship between mother parties and affiliate youth parties work all over the world. Stephen, do you want to come in here on the 2017 events?
Yeah, thanks, Fergal. That's a pretty good summation of how I kind of led to this point. You know, I mean, as a especially around some of the blatant kind of sectarianism in a 6-county context of how we understand that word to a lot of Northern members. The CPI in the North has always had a pretty good and proud history of bringing members from the Protestant community over to a more Republican understanding of politics, and it is just blatant name calling. Realistically, King Billy Communist, Orange Communist, as a CYM member within that name calling, I was simultaneously an ultra Republican Castellite at a Kim Billy Unionist Communist.
It's totally delusional. And to be honest, after the huge amount of effort that like Michael O'Riordan and other past leaders of the party put into reuniting it and making a party where everyone could feel welcome, there's this tendency to try and tap into people's prejudices, people's kind of the underbelly of like, I guess, the national consciousness in Ireland, that people are either too Republican or too Unionist. It was totally unacceptable. It brought kind of brought the entire organisation into disrepute. Huge misbehaviour.
Yep, absolutely. And just to add on that, well, finally, before I go into some of the events that happened in 2017 that Fergal was actually directly involved in as well. You can have political disagreements about how we achieve the for to workers' republic. Even within a communist organization, it's how they're hashed out. Then during this whole kind of conversation, I've never actually heard what the apparent unionism of the Northern members are. It is just complete slander, and yeah, as Fergal said, it's important to note as well that the CPI is the coming together of two parties. The area committees kind of reflect that, and yeah, it's just the effort to go in, they unite two communist parties, and I just like they have all that work undone is just completely unacceptable. But there was a growing kind of narrative from the CPI leadership that that the CPI does not meddle in the affairs of the CYM. The CYM needs to respect us as a separate organisation. They identified us throughout this process as a separate organisation. In fact, declining a few bilaterals at the time.
And the clique did interfere with us. They kind of got our summer school cancelled at one point.
Yeah. But they did characterize as that they shouldn't attend cross meetings with us because they apparently don't conduct relations with external organizations that way. That was said well before disaffiliation, but this is evident in 2017 where there's documented evidence in the form of emails from an old CYM Hotmail account, which shows that members within the CPI who are now in all leadership positions colluded in secret to actually try to dissolve the NEC as it was known back then before the Arcana of the CYM and also the core branch of the CYM party. This happened when our current General Secretary and Fergal himself here began to recruit CYM members and start to have an influence. Again, this was direct collusion between dual party and CYM members at the time and the General Secretary of the CPI to maintain control of the CYM, going so far to actually dissolve entire branches to maintain control rather than any investigation and punishment. Those involved all find themselves in prominent officer or committee positions within the party. 4 of them now sit on the NEC and basically have contributed to the last 4 years breakdown in that relationship. So that kind of just epitomizes the attitude and because of sort of like the breakdown of communications within structures of the CPI, not a lot of people actually knew this as well before going in, and a lot of CPI members and I think it just kind of shows there's certain sections within the party that don't want kind of rank and file members to actually know that this stuff has happened. There was also there was a growing narrative as well that this was a spat between COM officers and CPI officers. 3 members of the CPI have been expelled. 4 others have been threatened with expulsion. Dual COM, CPI members, including yourself here before we actually disaffiliated. There's been prominent members within the CPI that have resigned over this. The northern area of the party in particular has raised these concerns again and again to the NEC of the party, but I've basically just been told that these concerns they're not legitimate. They've been issued dictate they withdraw their letters and their concerns, and these are people that have struggled for communism within and within the party for decades, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to see the way that they have been treated in that. And some members have just rightly said this is sort of enough. There's not the democratic structures within the organisation to rectify this out, which is a real shame.
And a huge part of the problem is this whole idea of backroom deals for power and influence. Like the whole plot to dissolve and reconstitute branches and entire committees and stuff like that. It just isn't the way an organization should be conducting business. Like what we've always tried to do with the CYM is conduct our business openly on its merits, and trying to turn us against each other or these divide and conquer tactics are something that have been introduced again and again, where especially trying to take advantage of geographical differences or referring to people as, too Republican or too Unionist. A huge part of it is trying to create splinters within elements of your own fellow party members and turn them against each other. And this kind of divisiveness, when we should be pulling together and focusing on our commonalities, I feel is a total kind of misunderstanding and violation of the basic principles of solidarity and how we should conduct ourselves politically as comrades. In this context, it was making it more and more inevitable that a disaffiliation would have to occur, because this inhibits growth. If you're in a really toxic environment like that, it discourages people from activism. For people to really make a commitment and to grow as activists, then there has to be a good environment. There has to be camaraderie and solidarity, kind of creating an environment on purpose that's intentionally divisive, that intentionally tries to turn people against each other, and try to use the complexities of living in divided communities for, self-interested political gain is disgraceful. We should never be in a position where kind of a southern, mostly southern concentrated clique is able to forcibly impose measures on northern comrades who have to work and live in sensitive conditions. I think wiser comrades in the CPI understood this historically, but this understanding has just kind of been thrown out the window and jettisoned in favor of a very kind of short-sighted and kind of narrow-minded perspective. With so many people being expelled and re-registered, with so many of our respected comrades and mentors being pushed out of the party, resigning in disgust, it just became clear that disaffiliation was the only course available to us. Many party members today are left with the two options or three options of either leaving, collaborating, or waiting to be isolated and picked off. And to see so many people we admire and so many people we worked with so closely over the years ending up faced with this choice is frankly kind of quite heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thank you very much. Something that was touched on during this, which bears clarification, which should be clarified, is this idea that some of these conflicts and disputes were more personal than political. So let's set the record straight on this particular point as well. Was disaffiliation based more so on personal disagreements and differences, or were there concrete political differences which have given rise to this?
Okay. So
yeah, I mean, I would probably just repeat, what I said earlier is that, I know just from my personal experience that I have more stark, and contrasting political views, obviously within, Marxism, Leninism, and socialist republicanism, to all our members of the CYM than some members within the CPI. Now, in general, I would say that there is probably some, political differences between the CYM and the CPI more generally. But again, I think that it is really hard to gauge, especially because of how kind of fractured the CPI is at the moment, as a consequence of the actions around, surrounding the clique. They essentially all operate in a way that doesn't have respect for, the rank and file membership, and constitutionally as well, the area committees, and politically within the constitution, both operationally and politically with some of the political lines, including an article within Socialist Voice written by a prominent member of the CPI that actually, essentially attacks the National Health Service. And this is within Socialist Voice. It's one of the publications of the CPI. Just as a side note as well, Socialist Voice has been declared within the party as the official newspaper of the party itself. Now, this is despite the fact that there is also a Northern-based publication called Unity. And, instead of, trying to kind of, unite the two, pardon the pun, or kind of have some sort of, coherence between them, they've, in the meantime, basically elevated Socialist Voice above that. Now, it is true that Socialist Voice has opinion articles within it. There, ironically, a lot of the CYM contributions within it, despite the fact not really disagreeing with anything with the CPI saying, a lot of them written by CYM and CPI dual members have been put under as opinion. But this article actually attacking the NHS, again, to the disgust of, a lot of the rank and file members, obviously particularly in the north for obvious reasons, but wasn't actually filed under opinion, and reads as if it's actually forming party lines as well. And again, that's just on a complete ad hoc basis. The kind of reaction out and within the CPI shows that actual conversation isn't taking place. So yes, there probably is certain political differences, but it is actually incredibly hard to gauge, and I'm actually very confused as to give as to point to certain political disagreements, because again, it is just so confusing to navigate, at least from my perspective. I don't know, if yourself, Fergal, you have anything more to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are very rarely political disagreements without personal disagreements and vice versa. It's an inevitable part of life in small political organisations. But sometimes social relationships will play overly prominent roles at the expense of political coherence. Part of the antagonism is that the CYM has grown larger, and so our democratic centralism has become healthier, and political questions are decided in mass meetings in the open and not in pubs and back offices. Part of what has drawn us into and kept us in the CYM is that it has a refreshing political culture that emphasises transparency and honesty. The CPI, which hasn't experienced the same rapid growth as the CYM, didn't undergo the same process of professionalisation, and the efforts by the clique to stunt its growth were partially aimed with the intent of preserving these informal kind of social power structures. Bigger CPI would have been more robust and expressive, and incompetent people wouldn't have been able to coast by on social connections alone. This is partly why alarm bells began ringing when the growth of CYM started to threaten the CPI with a similar growth in membership. And it's kind of like, a threatening with a good time sort of thing, in the sense that, like, the CPI should want to grow. It's like CPI shouldn't be in a situation where it should be seeing growth and positive changes in the organisation as a potential threat, simply for the fact that it's just against change more generally. I mean, it's an absurd marker of stagnation of the clique that you would end up in a situation where, as communists, you saw any kind of, revolution or change as being fundamentally undesirable. Our political differences from the CPI aren't so massive that they couldn't have been ironed out if everyone had come to the table in good faith with sincere intentions, and I think everyone could have abided by that outcome in the spirit of democratic centralism. Unfortunately, no negotiations or spirit of reconciliation were forthcoming at any point. It was just a very hard response, and with that said, some political differences have emerged. One of them is around socialist republicanism and the CYM's commitment to it as a fundamental principle. Ironically, the so-called King Billy communists in the north respect our right to define ourselves as socialist republicans. Even if some of them are coming at it from another perspective, we respect and share enough in common to tolerate these small differences. However, while members of the clique in the south have postured to Republicans at the Paddy O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, behind closed doors, it's another matter entirely. They denounced us as Costelloite adventurers. It reveals that the Dublin clique's position on the national question is a contradictory windboard of convenience, and they're simply sectarian in their contempt for people from unionist communities, even if they support Irish unity. Meanwhile, you're happy to harp on, like the Irish Independent, about thistles, just because people read Costello or Costello or whatever. And the composition of the Connolly Youth Movement in the North has genuinely bridged sectarian barriers by remaining principled and open to dialogue about socialist republicanism. The clique lacks the sincerity to convince young people of the same vision and undermines all of our work by weaponizing partition against itself. If we take dogmatic positions on these issues, we fail all our people by providing no constructive socialist alternative to unionism or left and right free statism. To quote Eugene McCartan, the Ardèche also amended the constitution to include a statement on socialist republicanism as the manifestation of Marxism-Leninism in Ireland. This is a grossly unscientific assertion, breathtaking in its arrogance and opportunism. Besides this obvious political issue about socialist republicanism, there is also a huge thing of styles of work or approaches to work, in that we very much centered our work on grassroots community work, on things like direct action, whereas, and recruitment drives for the trade union movement, whereas very much the clique's approach to how they want to affect political change in Ireland is based around lobbying people. And I mean, there are a lot of excellent members of the CPI who do fantastic grassroots work, but the actual clique sees its role more as moving demands in the trade union leadership and other elements of kind of left parliamentary politics to the left. Whereas our role we've always seen as actually building nuclei and cells of communists in communities, in workplaces, and in educational centres. So, I mean, the inspiration of those comrades who share our vision in this, in the CPI, has been one of the main things that's kept me going in my own political work. I'm sad to say the best comrades are the one who suffered the most persecution by the clique, but they taught us to be better and gave us a more just example to emulate. Leaving the CPI after 6 years of membership, I still feel it was worthwhile for the exact reason of knowing and working with comrades like these, some of whom are no longer with us. Wherever our path takes us, the inspiration of these comrades and the figures before our time, like Michael O'Riordan, Benny Sinclair, and Madge Davison, will always stay with us and shape our political outlook and principles. Affiliated from the clique, but the legacy of the Irish Communist movement is also our legacy. One final issue I can think about raising is about liberalism and identity politics, and I've seen a few people online speculating about this and saying, I mean, there have been some comrades across the sea who've taken a shot in the dark and missed badly by extrapolating important issues in British left circles to Ireland and assuming that these issues occupy the same kind of polarising power in Ireland as they do in England. Just to be clear on it, there are zero differences between the position of the CYM and the CPI about so-called identity politics. Both organisations reject liberalism, don't have a specific stance on identity, and every member has their own kind of unique spin on it. The notion that the CYM is more liberal or ad lib than the CPI is just a fantasy based on paranoia. You can prove this by, for example, going through past issues of the Socialist Voice and comparing them with past issues of Forward. You'll see articles from different ends of different spectra in both situations. What you will see about organizations is that there's a complex tapestry of individual opinions based on different backgrounds of research and personal experience. Neither organization is a hive mind. We've developed enough to discuss and tolerate differing opinions respectfully as long as they satisfy the basic litmus test of applying socialist thought and incorporating human dignity and inclusion into their perspectives. We've struggled together long enough that we try always to give each other the benefit of the doubt as to our motives. When we disaffiliated, what was foremost in our minds was protecting and preserving the traditions of the Irish Communist movement and not abandoning them. If I had a chance to speak to some members of the clique today, I'd say, give us what you got in your day. Michael O'Riordan stepped down 23 years before he passed away. 10 10 years ago, or 10 years after Jimmy Stewart stepped down. And with each generation of the party, there's been a dignified and controlled passage of kind of trust and change of the guard. All your career comrades with foresight have passed on the reins when the time was right. Instead of obstructing or attacking you, they've mentored and taught you. You never gave us the benefit of that. And the only school of experience we've had through learning about politics is struggling basically not to get expelled by you year after year. A dozen times I've heard different people in the clique denounce Khrushchev and Gorbachev and lamented they couldn't see how destructive their own actions were. But have a look at yourself now and understand how easy it is from one link in the chain to ruin the hopes built up by so many others. I mean, your friends in the generation that came up with you have been with you since the start, and they're going to nod their heads along with you no matter what you do. And that's why, as long as you lack the courage to step aside and give our generation a chance, the party will continue to implode. If you're at all worried about your legacy or how you're going to, about how history might look on you unfavorably, the best way to avoid it is by acting for the future of the party, by working with its young inheritors and repudiating sycophants rather than using them as kind of useful tools for your own purposes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big questions that people probably, watching this would be asking is sort of, what's next for the CYM? The answer to that now, would be, I wouldn't know. We're a democratic organisation, and as officers, the mandate right now is to speak, as spokespersons for the decision of the membership as it is. We're not going to really speculate or declare policy or strategy on the fly, as you can imagine. What we can say definitely is that we'll be entering a transition period, like I said before. The membership will decide our future course soon. I'm definitely excited to see what the future holds. I think the best work the COM has is definitely ahead of us. The challenge facing us there within the CPI, we have overcome that challenge, and it's definitely consumed a lot of our time. But the actual morale of the organization's high now. Once it, as we've kind of passed that, and kind of go ahead in the future. The extra time is going to go where it's needed now, representing young workers in Ireland. Regardless of what shape the transition period takes, I'm confident that we will succeed. Now, as for the clique within the CPI, it controls the party apparatus. It's unchallenged, top to bottom now. Despite its threats, though, it doesn't have enough members under 30 left. They kind of set up its own, youth rival organisation to the CYM or, like a YCL. That would just be, probably embarrassing to its membership at this point. And, I don't say that as an insult. I just say that, as an actual observation. Probably they will get their wish and push out the remaining Northern members. That's what I would say. And I think, that process will happen quite soon. Obviously, that is, it isn't just conjecture. I did spend a lot of time within the CPA myself. That'll leave the rump of, 16 members sitting in, endless meetings. Old soldiers never die. They basically, they simply fade away. So that's basically what I have to say. Kind of, long term within the leadership. I would definitely kind of reiterate, kind of what Fergal said there, last question there, Paul. I think, kind of summing it up, I suppose the political difference is the attitude towards democratic centralism. I did highlight earlier that, I probably have more contrasting positions, obviously with respect to our own party's programme and constitution. They are COM members. The difference is that those differences, aren't actually going to threat, threat the existence of the organisation. One thing that Fergal did highlight was the Pat O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. And the CPI, they're heavily involved in that initiative, and it is a good initiative. Or working with people that would and working with people that would have been involved quite actively within the anti-imperialist struggle in Ireland, directly and physically at the same time, and would have quite critical opinions around like a border poll or the Good Friday Agreement and stuff like that. And at the same time, branding us as a Coastalite, adventurists and all sorts. And as well, just to add, from a northern experience, there was actually a lot of confusion about that initiative itself. The initiative, as you can imagine, is a 32-county initiative, but members in the north of the CPI at its inception were told explicitly from the leadership of the CPI that this is a 26-county one, and they weren't allowed to be involved in it. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's very confusing.
Yeah,
a lot of conflicting stuff.
I hope that does answer some of the questions that viewers would have on that. And if it does seem confusing, it is because it is. Do you know what I mean? And there isn't some sort of clear answer. But the clearest answer, I think, from my perspective, and I think we can say confidently as the organisation as a whole, the political disagreement was how we interpret democratic centralism, and I think the strength of our organisation. And the kind of momentum that we still have, even under COVID and even after, severing the ties from the CPI shows that, I think that we definitely have the right attitude towards it against the CPI's leadership attitude towards it, because there is members of the CPI that quite strongly have identified those issues themselves, and again, we enjoy mutual support from.
Absolutely, thank you very much for that. That's great. It really clarified a lot. Probably begs a lot more questions as well. Sure. Yeah, there's a lot more question marks hanging over everything that's happened here, but that's great. Thank you.
But I mean, that's what communism is about. You're supposed to leave with more questions.
Exactly. Brilliant. Thanks very much, comrades. I really, really appreciate that, and I really appreciate both of you coming on this evening to talk about these things, to flesh out this conversation a little bit more, and to hopefully demystify and clarify what's going on at the moment. So, just before we wrap up, do either of you have any closing remarks for the audience that you'd like to communicate? Maybe any upcoming events or activities that the CYM is going to be involved in, or anything else that you'd like to shout out or plug or whatever else it might be?
Yeah, so I just want to kind of sum up on where we're going in our future. I mean, the CYM is probably one of the largest youth organisations in Ireland at the moment, and even by that standard, we punch well above our weight. Very few youth organisations have their own publications, libraries, housing occupations, trade union workshops, and sustained disruption and cultural jamming of the establishment narrative. CYMers are a really talented bunch, but that's just part of the story. Our style of organisation lends itself to inspire and empower, and the way we rely on each other as a collective enables each member to far exceed their individual potential. Many right-wing and left-wing youth groups are political theatre. They're debate clubs that are highly competitive, self-interested, and centred around people trying to get noticed by patrons for pull and benefits. CYM is the opposite. It's much more collaborative. We're here for our class. It's highly egalitarian and democratic because we want to try and reflect the values we want to see on a larger scale in society. We have big plans for community clinics after the pandemic restrictions are lifted, and members have been using their time to study and brush up on skills that are of most value to people in their estates, schools, and workplaces. Internationally, we're doing a big push for Cuban solidarity this year, at a time when there needs to be progress on smashing the criminal blockade, and also on preventing Ireland from following the blood-stained path to NATO that Fine Gael proceeds through. Domestically, we need to position ourselves to be ready as we come out of 47% youth unemployment, be closely enmeshed in communities, to reactivate resistance to the inevitable round of cuts that the COVID recession will be used to justify. After the last recession, people talked about a lost generation. If we don't take action this year, it'll be more than one generation of young people who've lost out on any opportunities or hope in their lives. As a group, we spend a lot of time defining ourselves by what we're not, because we see a lot of mistakes and misleading posturing on the left in Ireland. We're not here to wait around and see. we're not here to compromise. We're here to win by any and every method, because we've seen the tragedy engulfing the lives of our friends and families. It's caused and perpetuated by the economic system on this island and the politically powerful groups that benefit from it. And the people who are in no hurry to get rid of it have to bear the part of the responsibility for that suffering. There's a fire in all of us to keep going until there's nobody in Ireland without a home, without a job, without a meaningful relation to their community and a purpose. Anyone who shares that vision and wants to be part of it can join us. Disaffiliation just means that we're moving from consolidation to the offensive and expanding the scope of our work. Comrades, 2020 will be a red decade.
Thanks for that, Fergal. Yeah, definitely back up everything that he's saying there, 100%. Fergal's the editor for our publication for it, so he has a lot of flair there. Definitely, probably something that I don't have. But yeah, look, specifically, definitely want to give a shout out to some of the initiatives that the CYM have been doing and sustained over the past few years, particularly Connolly Barracks, the 3 or 4 year long occupation of a previously vacant property down in Cork. Definitely check it out if you haven't, online or when COVID's over. Definitely get a scope of that if you are in Cork. I want to give a shout out to the Dublin branch as well for growing massively over the past few months, especially under COVID. Shout out to all the smaller branches that have just started up, and like newer branches like Galway, Limerick, Waterford, the cultural capital of Ireland, as I call it, as a native Derry. And speaking as a member of the Belfast branch in particular, if anyone's around that area, the West Belfast part of the CYM of Belfast in particular have been working like absolute oxes around food banks. Comrades like Connolly and Amy down there really grafting. We have comrades that are, outside of the CYM specifically, that are directly involved in the fight against the COVID pandemic. Care workers and that. Want to give a big shout out to our previous women's officer, who's all member of the CYM, Sarah, for her efforts in that. The Belfast chair, Rory, as well, has been really, really basically started this branch and has sustained it. Obviously it's a group effort, but we need kind of leaders like that within our movement, and especially our newer members as well, who have through this whole process, this has actually been their only interaction with the CPI. So definitely appreciate them for having the patience to kind of stick with us during this whole ordeal, because they didn't join the CYM. They have these debates about King Billy communists or Stalwart of interest and stuff like that. So it is just really inspiring to see. And again, I want to reiterate the support for all the good comrades that are still left within the CPI, and the ones that have basically been forced out of it or kind of decided to leave on their own terms based off this.
Absolutely. Listen, thanks very much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure all the comrades in CYM are going to be delighted for the little shout out there.
Yeah.
And to acknowledge all the fantastic successes and achievements and advances and moves forward that have happened. So listen, comrades, thanks again for taking some time out this evening to come on. I hope you've found it enjoyable as I have. Hopefully comrades who are watching this will find it useful, to get something from it. And yeah, all the best to everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Long fall. Take care, everyone.